Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. Kane. We're continuing our discussion of Scottish nationalism.
We are indeed.
Yeah, so was there a nationalist movement after 1707?
Yes, there was, but not immediately. There's a kind of cultural nationalism, but I said to you in the last episode that at the very beginning, the kind of elite flocked to London. You know, they wanted to be down where all this stuff was happening.
It's a nice city.
And yeah, you know, so they're down there. And even in the 1760s, you have the Scottish Enlightenment, which is incredibly important. You'll notice that there's no English Enlightenment. People just talk about the Enlightenment.
They're still waiting for theirs.
Yeah, the Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment. So the Scottish Enlightenment's well underway. But again, people are still kind of focused, the elite, the well-educated are focused on publishing things in good English and speaking properly and all that kind of stuff. But by the time you get to the late 1700s, of course, you get a kind of cultural revival with Robert Burns. Again, kind of reclaiming the way people normally speak. Lowland Scots, and there's a lot of that. But in terms of politics, really the first indication that there's any kind of political pushback to the Union, and that might be a broad generalization, but just go with me on this, is by about the 1850s. So about the 1850s, there's quite a bit of worry that Scotland's actually disappearing. So that thing that I said, you know, people are still thinking, well, it's okay because, you know, we're Scottish, we're in Scotland, it'll be fine. There is a bit of worry then by the 1850s, and you see the rise of an association called the National Association for Scottish Rites, and that's in 1853. And it's interesting because it's not a call for a repeal of the Union necessarily. So it's not people saying, oh yeah, we have to get out of this. This is just awful. But it's just a kind of call for more attention from Westminster, like just not getting a fair deal at Westminster. And there was a call for a Secretary of State, the position of Secretary of State, to be revived. And it's you'd find it probably quite charming. And so Scotland might be disappearing. We need a Secretary of State. We also need a monument to William Wallace, your man right behind you there, and an end to calling Scots Scotch. So we're a bit, kind of peaked. We were like, I can't stand that. So no response from London, of course. So like, yeah, okay, you want like a political thing, a Wallace monument, and you want us to call you Scots? I don't think so. We don't really need to bother about that. And then by the late, mid to late 1800s, of course, Scotland industrializes quite early on, and of course gives us many of the inventors like James Watt that do all sorts of wonderful things to actually kind of kick off the Industrial Revolution. But Scotland by the mid to late 1800s, it's the victim of Industrial Revolution style poverty, really, really poor living conditions, and its cities go from being seen as some of the most beautiful cities in Europe, the second city of the empire, Glasgow, to being seen as some of the most horrible in the empire. So,
that was a big empire.
And it's a big empire, yes, it's a big empire by that time. So a great appeal of socialism, naturally, and oddly enough, nationalism. So nationalism and socialism, and those two things don't necessarily always go together because Marx is kind of an internationalist and not really all that keen on nationalism. So it's interesting that you get, the call, the siren's call of socialism, but you also get the rise of nationalism at the same time. And you get the Scotsman Keir Hardie founding the Independent Labour Party, and the Scotsman Campbell Bannerman becomes leader of the Liberal Party, and he supported things like Home Rule for Ireland, and he became the British Prime Minister just after the turn of the century, and this kind of rekindled an interest in things like Scottish Home Rule and, kind of a fair shake for everybody. And then in About 1911, Winston Churchill was on tour in Scotland, and he declared his support for devolution for both Scotland and Ireland. So, you know, kind of people thinking about stuff like that. And this was, I suppose, in response to the British government's support for Home Rule in Ireland. And of course, Irish history is even more complex than Scottish history at that particular point. And in 1911, you get a new party emerging called the Young Scots. Not the Young Scotch, no, because that would be bad. The Young Scots. And it called for a devolution of power, so power to come back to Scotland, but it was also concerned with social problems, so that would be a kind of socialist element, I suppose. And 1911 saw mass rallies for Home Rule backed by speaking tours by a number of politicians. And so actually, before the outbreak of World War I, there's another thing we can blame for the war. In 1913, a bill for Scottish Home Rule passed second reading in the House. Of course, they have to go to third reading, but it passed second reading in the House. And the question asked is, well, why was there support for it at that particular time? Well, MPs at Westminster said that the government was so backed up that it just wasn't getting through all the things that it should, and that Home Rule and having separate parliaments would make the overall parliamentary system work a bit more effectively, so that's quite good. And secondly, it was seen as a pragmatic response to the growth of empire, and of course you have a theory from the 1850s on called the positive theory of empire. So you're actually looking at places like Canada, sometimes in those days referred to as the White Empire, places like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and thinking of giving them a bit more power over their affairs, not everything being controlled from London. So why not for the place that's right next to you? Why for Canada and but not for Scotland? So, all those kind of questions raised. And so it's seen as a kind of evolutionary development of the Scottish state as well, and a way of being fair to Scotland vis-a-vis Home Rule for Ireland. So a lot of interest in it in 1911, 1913. But of course, the outbreak of World War I ended all hopes of Scottish devolution. And of course, the Irish started to take theirs by force in 1916 in the Easter Rising. So they were well on their way to being independent, and we got kind of left behind. So during the war, Scotland became quite radicalised. You have a number of things happening. One of the coolest ones is the Glasgow women's rent strike, where the men were away fighting, and the landlords, various landlords in Glasgow decided they were just going to put the rents up, and the women just went on strike, refused to pay, just kind of shut the whole place down. It's really, really interesting. You also have one of my heroes, John Maclean, and John Maclean's desk is in the People's Palace on Glasgow Green, and he became the British emissary to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, so he became the Bolshevik ambassador to Britain, although he was actually in Scotland, so slap on the wrist to Lenin. And John Maclean, of course, read the Red Clydeside in worker strikes in 1919, and the red flag, yes, the red flag of communism flew in George Square in Glasgow, and you had the Scottish Trade Union Congress voting to support peace all the way through the war. So in London, they were really worried by this kind of total radical Clydeside, because of course Glasgow's on the River Clyde, that's where all the major shipbuilding was being done. So they were worried in London because a lot of the war munitions were manufactured on the Clyde, and of course if they all went communist, that wouldn't be helpful at all. So the Parliament in England decided to send the army to Glasgow to restore order, and any kind of support for Home Rule just disappeared. So they've already had violence in Ireland. They were like, oh my God, radicalisation of the Clyde, we can't have that at all. So all that kind of parliamentary support for Home Rule ended, and then in the interwar years, the workers voted Labour, and there's of course a massive post-war recession, and demonstrations, thousands strong, of people out on the streets saying we want a parliament. So the support the parliamentary support for it drops, the support by the people themselves increases. And there's a number of private members' bills introduced by Scottish MPs for home rule, but of course private members' bills usually go nowhere, as we know, in the modern period. And the Scots MPs were thrown out at one point for being too unruly, so just, didn't know their place. And by 1926, of course, you get the general strike, and the whole question of home rule is dropped from the Labour Party platform. And even though the Prime Minister is Ramsay MacDonald, a Scot, but it's kind of dropped then, and you get you just get a variety of things happening, but it's mostly kind of people rather than politics. So in Scotland, you get the National Party of Scotland about 1928, created to fight on a single issue, and that's the issue of home rule. But it's torn apart, as so often happens, by factions, and one part left and became the Scottish Party, and it was kind of right-wing, so the Scottish Party and the National Party of Scotland. And in 1934 they reunited as the Scottish National Party, but not really taken all that seriously at that point anyway, and workers continued to vote Labour. And this has always been a problem for Scottish nationalists, that Scotland tends not to vote Tory, but it does tend to vote Labour, because the concerns of ordinary people hopefully looked after. And of course Labour, run by Ramsay MacDonald, and he decided that he would support home rule. And in 1929, just kind of, for the Depression beginning, the Labour and Conservatives formed a national coalition government, and of course, this is the next 10 years are going to be the Great Depression, and the coalition government supported something called administrative devolution. So it does come back up on the radar. And in 1937, it brought in a thing called the Gilmore Report, and that recommended that a Scottish office be set up in Edinburgh. So kind of, the Parliament again kind of responding, it won't give me too much power, but really set up a Scottish office. And of course, it's often good if you can throw a kind of couple of goodies people's way to kind of keep them quiet. So the Empire exhibition, which splendid by every account, the Empire exhibition of 1938 was also held in Glasgow. And there's all sorts of really cool accounts of it, and I know my much loved Sheila Kerr, she was at it. And she was at it and taught me a little bit about it in the summer when I was visiting her. So by the end of the 30s, you've got the Gilmore Report recommending a Scottish office. So kind of appealing to people, but not giving them too much. But but at the same time, whenever there's something like an economic downturn, like the Great Depression, people are more concerned about where their next bit of haggis is coming from, where their next pot of mashed potatoes is coming from, rather than kind of bigger issues like we want our own parliament.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Did things calm down after the Gilmore Report?
Well, in a sense, you get the Great Depression, and then you're right into World War II, so nothing's really going to happen because everybody's concerned about the war effort. So nothing really until the end of World War II, and then Labour came to power again and created, of course, the Beveridge Report, the welfare state cradle to grave. So really looking out for the interests of workers and ordinary people, and so that kind of made people, they're like, oh, okay, and there's like post-war prosperity. So people were kind of a bit happier because the economic boom lasted for more than a decade. And again, when people are really, really poor, or they're doing really, really well, they're not really all that worried about politics. It's that bit in the middle when things start to go belly up that you're like, right, that's it. The Labour government through that period nationalised all the major industries, including coal, and this kind of increased Scots dependency on London, and that was good when things were going well, but less so when things start to turn bad. So in the late 1950s, you start to see economic troubles reappearing. The jobless rate, of course, higher in Scotland than it was in England. Same thing that we've seen in Canada as well in the past, that if there was a big company that owns something and it had plants in Scotland and England, where's it going to close its plants first? Well, if it's an English company, it's going to close its branch plants in Scotland. So any sign of economic downturn, the Scots things would close first, and then later on it would be the coal mines that would be closed. So the late 1950s, the early 60s, you start to see political action on the rise again, and in so much so that in 1967 Winnie Ewing won for the Scottish Nationalist Party in a by-election in Hamilton, despite the fact that there was terrible anti-Scots propaganda both by the Labour Party and the Tories. And Labour was worried because Scotland tended to vote Labour most of the time, and it needed the Scots votes to win in Britain. So little worried about the rise of this. And the SNP continued to do well in the 1970s, and in the 1974 general election, the SNP won about a third of the votes and sent 11 MPs to Westminster. So now you had 11 MPs who were there to get Scotland out of the Union, and that caused problems because Labour only had a slim majority. So they offered a Scottish Assembly, so an assembly, a kind of a parliament, but one that didn't have very many powers, and nobody really liked that idea. The SNP wanted home rule, so they were denounced either as tartan Tories or tartan socialists. So you couldn't really win, and people said, the economy will just collapse, and they actually in the Hansard, if you look at some of the debates in the 70s when the SNP were in Westminster, people, you have MPs taking lessons from 1707 and saying, well, look, your economy practically collapsed then, and we just kind of rescued you, and now you want out, you ungrateful swines, and the same thing will happen. There'll be economic collapse. So people, the Tories and Labour just tried to kind of frighten people and say, well, if you go with this, you're going to be poor, and then you'll have to come back begging, and it kind of smacks of referendum-y things that we've seen in Canada, or especially places like Quebec, where you go, oh yeah, well, if you leave, you're gonna have to pay us a whole lot of money before you go, and then you might not make it. So kind of trying to frighten people. We don't do that anymore, of course, but I believe we did.
We still kind of do it a little bit, yeah.
Period. So the Conservatives denounced the Home Rule campaign. They had a really well-financed propaganda thing all set up, and scared businesses. And Labour didn't push for Home Rule either. They said it wouldn't work, and they wouldn't work with the SNP either. So they decided in 1979 to use a referendum. So and hopefully that would kind of give you a clear cut. Well, obviously,
go on and tell us what happened.
Go on yourself. So they decided to use a referendum, and there was this provision made that 40% of the whole electorate had to vote in favour of it, and this is of course what does it in the end. And it's very much like the Quebec example, where you needed in that case 50% plus to win, and you get like 49.1%, so you don't win. So again, lots of fear-mongering. MPs said that Scotland had been finished in 1707, it was saved by the Union, and if it chose an assembly, it'd be finished again, and then it would have to come back with its begging bowl in hand, and worked out really horrific economic scenarios, and people were kind of panicky, and young people were really in favour of it, and they would go and vote in the referendum, but their parents would cancel out their votes because there's two parents and one kid. They would vote Labour because that was what they were used to, and they thought that Labour protected the rights of workers, and hopefully it did. They needed 400,000 votes to get it passed, and in the end they got 329,000 voted yes and 310,000 voted no. So 51% or 51.6% voted yes, but it wasn't 40% of the overall number of people that could, of all eligible voters. And a lot of people said, well, there are dead people still on the register, and people that weren't at weren't on the proper address, that were still on the electoral register as well. So the referendum, it just doesn't work out at all. So 51.6%, I believe, voted in favour this Scotland Act, but they lost because of the 40% thing. So yeah, kind of difficult, you know. And John Major asked, you know, much later on, of course, conservative. Much later on, asked about devolution just in general, and of course you could have spoken to MPs at the time as well, but talking as well about the late 90s and what devolution would mean. And this is just a little thing from the newspaper, and they were asking John Major in 96, what are your real fears about devolution? And he said, devolution is the midwife of separation. There you go. So it's just like, so even to have a vote on devolution, not have a vote on actual independence, that's the beginning of the end. He said it would undermine the unity of the United Kingdom, threatening our success and fueling division. A tartan tax-raising parliament could do nothing to help Scotland, but a lot to destroy it. It's a very real danger. As for referendum, after legislation, it would be sensible, but holding one before legislation invites Scotland to buy a pig in a poke. So even in the 90s, when it comes up again, a lot of opposition to it. So remember, like in the late 70s, it's Thatcher land. She's not interested in home rule. There's a massive restructuring of the economy, and Scottish-based industries, of course, suffer first, and there's rampant unemployment. And I remember being in Glasgow when the poll tax was tested, and there were riots and demonstrations as a result of that. And the late 70s then becomes and the 80s becomes a period of deindustrialisation for Scotland, and then there's of course the miners' strike in 1984, and manufacturing capacity in Scotland drops quite dramatically. People are incredibly upset, and the Scots virtually voted Labour in each election, and so they ignore the Conservatives, and in turn they're kind of ignored by Thatcher, and they become upset. They see themselves as being targeted, the targets for cuts, and ignored when they ask for more state assistance. And of course the sense was that Thatcher was taking full advantage of our North Sea oil, and we weren't getting much at all from it at all. And again, there was this impetus for devolution, even with the failure of that referendum. There's lots of non-partisan organisations, lots of professors working on what was called the Campaign for a Scottish Assembly that published papers and manifestos for devolution. And in 1988, they published a thing called A Claim of Rights for Scotland that gave the kind of intellectual basis for having a Scottish Parliament again, and the Labour Party actually supported that. The SNP didn't, because they still wanted like total independence, not just a kind of devolution of power. So they wanted to hold out for total independence, but Labour accepted the need for devolution because they had to keep their votes in Scotland. And they argued, of course, that no, people like the Conservatives were wrong, that it wouldn't break apart the United Kingdom at all, that it would strengthen it if all the nationalist aspirations of all the various peoples, Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, were actually met. So Labour responded with a kind of positive way to the campaign. And Thatcher, of course, replaced by John Major, now trying to fight off Labour, and the Conservatives actually needed Scottish votes, so he actually returned the Stone of Destiny to Edinburgh in the late 1990s. And the Stone of Destiny, of course, was the stone of Scone, and Scottish kings had been crowned on it all the way up until it was stolen by our friend William Wallace's enemy, Edward of England, Longshanks in Braveheart, or Edward the Hammer of the Scots, according to Fiona Watson. So the Stone of Destiny had been taken down to London, sat in Westminster under the coronation throne. Every king and queen since that point in England had been crowned over the Stone of Destiny, so they had it. We tried to steal it back twice in the 70s, in the 50s, and then again in the 70s, or in the time when the SNP were doing quite well. And so, with great ceremony, the Conservatives gave us back the Stone of Destiny, which now sits in Edinburgh Castle, I think it does, in Edinburgh Castle, behind glass. And, thought maybe that would be enough, and the Queen came out and said, here's your Stone of Destiny, you may have it back. So that kind of doesn't, that's not enough. It's not enough for the Scots. So like, well, thanks for the stone. That's very nice. And of course, then you have Tony Blair sweeping to power with what was called New Labour, and he proposed devolution manifestos for Scotland and Wales. And the first act of his new government was to introduce a bill to allow a referendum, and this time the referendum had 100% Labour support because they really needed the votes as well. And so the result of the devolution referendum was 72% voted yes to having a Scottish Parliament again. So resounding 72%, and 60%, just a little bit less, voted yes to giving it taxation powers. So this time the support was uniform from the north of Scotland up in the Orkneys all the way down to the borders. And of course then Scotland got its Parliament back, and Winnie Ewing, who had been the first and longest or the first SNP person to really hit the news, she became of course a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I think that she's probably still has the role of the longest sitting SNP MP, and she was the one that would call the sessions to order. So there's over 140 members of the Scottish Parliament and a First Minister, and the Parliament can legislate in domestic matters. And we have an actual Parliament building now, and as I said before, the referendum for total independence is set for 2014, and recently Alex Salmond and David Cameron were meeting to talk about the wording of the... I was really interesting because I was reading this wee article about it, and it said just recently, and it said that I think it was the Scottish Labour leader was saying, oh, you have to be really, really careful about the wording. And then somebody told her that in the Quebec referendum, that people really understood it well because it was 90 words long. And I think for us Canadians, we all knew that it was too long and people didn't understand it. So it's quite funny. So she's now saying that that it's the perception that people have that we have to work on, not what the actual wording is in the referendum. So it's going to be really interesting looking at what happens. But it just goes to show it's not lost forever. We give it up in 1707 and under completely different circumstances have it back now, and it may well have lead to full independence. In which case the history hut will be just buying a wee bothy in Scotland and going there to live out its life. I think you can visit.
Well, on that note, I think that wraps up our discussion of Scottish nationalism for now. Join us next time for more History Hut.
Bye.